Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Adam Ramey, and as you just learned, I'm an associate professor of political science here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and this is the second time that I've had the privilege of moderating a discussion around the U.S. elections. And indeed, while it has been said before that this election is really important, this one is particularly important, and I think for not just American citizens, but for citizens of the globe. The implications of who wins the White House in November and enters in January is going to have dramatic implications for the ongoing conflicts around the world, for global trade and international affairs more broadly. Tonight, that we're going to explore how a potential Harris or Trump 2 administration will impact global dynamics with a particular eye toward the Middle East, North Africa, and associated regions. To explore these topics, we have a very wonderful panel assembled tonight. I had no part in assembling this panel, but when I saw the names there, I was very happy to be in conversation with them this evening. On my far left over here, we have Jarrett Blanc, who's former Energy and National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Energy, the former Deputy Special Envoy for Iran, and the former Acting Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Also to my left here, we have Robin Brooks, who's currently State Department Fellow at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, but perhaps more importantly was former Special Advisor to Kamala Harris on Europe and Eurasia, and former NSC Director for Central Europe. And to my right, we have a visiting faculty member here at New York University in Abu Dhabi in the Social Research and Public Policy Program, Dave McCourt, who's also professor at the University of California, Davis. The way that we're going to, oh, thank you. You stole my line. I was going to invite you to warmly welcome them. So the way we're going to structure tonight's conversation is as follows. In a moment, I'm going to give each one of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves in more depth and to sort of offer some opening remarks on how they see things. I'm going to then ask a series of questions with occasional follow-ups that cover the main topics that I think affect global citizens in the context of these elections, namely the ongoing conflict in Russia and Ukraine, the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza, and of course potential trade wars and Cold Wars getting hot between the United States, China, and beyond. After that, we'll open the floor to the audience for questions. As it hopefully goes without saying, please keep your phones on silent, and we look forward to a wonderful discussion. So we'll just start all the way at the end here and make our way down the panel. So Jarrett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief in my introductory remarks because I do want to get to the questions and discussion. I am looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say. I will partially introduce myself by saying that hearing about the Institute and the upcoming programs makes me regret that I'm only here for a few days. It really does sound like a fantastic series of incredibly diverse discussions. The only thing I'll add is to echo the points that have been made and that I think everybody in this room certainly intuits, which is that this is an extremely unusual election in the United States. It is unusual in the degree of divisiveness in the country. It's unusual in the degree of pre-election violence that has already been seen, very complex pre-election violence, including violence that's affected the recent efforts at hurricane recovery in the southern part of the United States, where I'm originally from. And there is no question that it is going to have profound effects, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so starting with people who know much better than I, other regions of the world, to explore what those effects might be is something I'm very much looking forward to.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I also want to express my my interest and enthusiasm in the programs that you have here. It sounds like a fantastic place to be. I have been here for a couple of days and also wish that I could stay longer. I agree that these are really important elections, but as a foreign policy professional, I also think it's important for us to remember that historically in the United States, politics has stopped at the water's edge, which means that domestic policy concerns shouldn't affect our foreign policy necessarily, because I'm both a practitioner and also come from academia, but in international relations theory, we envision states as black boxes operating in a system, and those black boxes are always seeking the same thing, and that is security and prosperity for the people inside, or economic growth. And that those goals don't change, and therefore the approach to it should only change at the margins after an election. But that said, in 2017, we saw some unexpected changes to the way that the United States approached its alliances and its partnerships, and to some of our policy and economic goals in the international system. And then in 2020 or 2021, we had to recalibrate to sort of try to get back to the status quo ante. So it will be very interesting to see what happens in this election and the at the beginning of the next administration. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Let me just say a little bit about myself. I'm the slight odd person out on this panel in that I'm purely an academic and quite a long way from the center of US foreign policy out there in California and now in Abu Dhabi. What I spend my days doing is actually watching the strange community of foreign policy experts and analysts in Washington, D.C. as they struggle over political power to be the few people who go into successive administrations. Because remember, this is an important point, the US has a system of political appointees, which is quite different from a lot of other countries that have permanent civil services. So every 4 years, there's a great influx and outflow of experts, policymakers, commentators, into specific administrations, and potentially people on this panel in the past and perhaps going forward as well. So what I spend my days doing is trying to read the tea leaves of the different camps of experts and commentators to try to see who might be the next group who are listened to under the next administration. So what I'll be trying to do is to think a little bit with you about the different groups that might go in under a Harris administration versus a Trump administration, and therefore what the implications would be for different policy areas. Because as the saying goes, in DC, personnel is policy.
Thank you so much. So I'll begin with my questions, and I should have said at the outset, I'm going to pose these questions to one of our panelists, but all the panelists should feel free to chime in as they see fit, and particularly if they disagree. So I'm going to start with Robin, and you were talking about the international system in your opening remarks, and so I want to talk a little bit more about that. In particular, so at the end of the Cold War, the United States was arguably the last hegemon, the Soviet Union having collapsed, and the monopolar world emerged with the U.S. at the top of it. But increasingly, we've seen in the last decade to 2 decades, the U.S. has been retreating from its assertive role in the sort of post-Cold War era. But at the same time, both China and Russia have reasserted themselves or asserted themselves more forcefully economically and geopolitically. How do you see the current geopolitical moment, and in particular, how do you see a potential Harris or a second Trump administration sort of navigating these complicated waters in the black box system, so to speak?
Thanks so much for that question. Well, first of all, I want to sort of disagree with the premise, because I don't think that there ever really was a time of U.S. hegemony or even reluctant hegemony. I think the United States plays an important role in the international system because we have a very large expeditionary foreign service with embassies in almost every country in the world, and the ability to get information, share information, and prompt action in a way that no other country really can, just because they don't have people on the ground in every country. And so as a result, after the fall of the Cold War, if anything, we certainly weren't seeking hegemony. We were seeking better relations with the Russian Federation, particularly because all of the countries of the former Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons transferred them to Russia, because Russia still possessed, and still to this day possesses, enormous quantity of fossil fuels and energy resources that Europe needs, and Europe is our most important ally. The countries of Europe and the European Union as a whole, within NATO, is our most important ally in securing a world system, and we didn't want to see a power vacuum in a huge country like Russia. And so it was in our interest to see Russia succeed, and that's, I think, what we were trying to do in the 1990s. And we tried to do it together with our European allies and partners. there were some difficult moments in the 90s. You'll recall the Western Balkans sort of fell apart in a series of civil and then genocidal wars, and there was an extent to which this was a reflection of Cold War policy continuing, because Russia continued to insert itself on behalf of some of its, maybe religious brethren, maybe friends with whom they had economic ties and so on. And then you also saw the United States turning to lots of other things besides Russia. At the same time, in the 1990s, we deepened and strengthened our relationships with partners in the Western Hemisphere through the North American Free Trade Agreement, for instance. We improved our ability to work with Mexico and Canada on production and trade. And so I would say, not hegemony, not reluctant hegemony, but a willingness to work with more partners, to work with new partners, including all of the countries of the former Soviet Union, all of the new republics that emerged then. And then fast forward to the current time, you asked about the current system, and I would say the current system is a product not just of the fall of the Cold War or even the war on terror, which is something we haven't yet addressed, but it's a product of a series of shocks to the system that include technology. AI and cybersecurity are important today in a way they never were before, and we can only address those challenges together with other partners. And climate change, another thing where without U.S. leadership, which we have seen in reality, without U.S. leadership, countries aren't able to get together and come to consensus on meaningful commitments to stop the progression of climate change and improve the way that we produce things and produce energy. And once the United States rejoined the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and went back to the Conference of the Parties, we saw more ambitious commitments by all states, not only by the United States. So we prompted China to make more commitments. We prompted India to make more commitments. We prompted all the countries of the world to reconsider a switch to renewable and sustainable sources of energy. I would say with regard to the election and how either outcome would likely affect that global system, that what we've seen is, again, that politics stops at the water's edge for the most part, that U.S. foreign policy changed in ways that maybe shocked some of us if we were following closely the Balkans, if we were following closely the intricacies of trade with China, for instance. But actually, the Trump administration's tariffs on China were a logical continuation of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, right? And that's why the Biden administration continued those policies, because they make sense in terms of not punishing China for what it's doing, but in terms of stimulating production in the United States, in terms of a reflection of the importance that we place on democratic values and human rights in our supply chains, so that forced labor and environmental damage caused by the way that China does some of its production were things that affect the United States and affect our allies in a way. And so on China, I don't think that you'll see a lot of change no matter what happens. But I do think you'll see a rhetorical change. And under the Trump administration, the way that the United States as a black box pursued power was to project power. And the way that the Biden administration has pursued power has been to expand our values, to broaden our relationships, including with emerging middle powers and the global south, to listen to what countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America have to say about climate, food security, health security, and how they want to participate in the development, in the just development of AI, for a better, more equitable future. So those are the changes that I think that you'll see, but for the most part, our foreign policy will still be one that is based on a desire to increase U.S. security and the prosperity of the American people in some sort of constellation of partners and alliances. Thanks.
Well, I mean, I would have to disagree with the argument that U.S. sort of retreated after 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. I think that the United States became ever more present across the world, particularly economically. Dollar hegemony, we have to think about the context of this, is the increased power of the dollar the increased involvement of the US domestic economic organizations in the activities of other countries around the world, thinking about central bank sanctioning of Russia and elsewhere. After the financial crisis, money didn't flow out of the United States, it flew into the American stock market in massive ways. We can think of the UAE's involvement in Wall Street. So I think that there is a way to think about, after 1989 and 1991, the US sort of looking around for allies and partners. But I think the flip side of that was a much greater involvement in the domestic politics of every other country in the world. So if the United States puts a company on its entities list, which means that not only US firms can't trade with it, but firms from other countries can't trade with it as well. So think of Huawei and why Britain had to get Huawei out of its telecommunications network. I think that's the framework. Call it hegemony. I call it hegemony. Some people call it empire. We might call it reluctant hegemony. But I do think that, perhaps not diplomatically, but as a fact, and I think you spoke to this a little bit, the US has only become more important after 1989, and we need to look at that. I mean, why are we here talking about a US election? US domestic politics is international politics.
And yet, at the same time, we have sort of a stark contrast. You know, Robin was talking a second about our allies and thinking about, you know, the stark contrast between Vice President Harris and former President Trump with regards to our NATO allies, for example. So one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the Cold War is a lot of countries that had previously been in the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet sphere joined NATO. NATO expanded all the way up to the Baltics. And this continues to be a contentious issue. And on one hand, you have Vice President Harris, who's been, you know, unequivocal in her support for U.S. NATO allies, and you have former President Trump, who has repeated his previous statements of "pay up or shut up." So with that in mind, sort of what should America's allies think about the you know, potential Trump return to the White House or the Harris administration taking over?
Thanks. I think it is certainly fair to say that not only our allies and partners, but also our strategic, systemic rivals throughout the world have been waiting for this U.S. election probably for the last 3.5 years. In fact, I think because of those rhetorical shifts and those actual shifts at the margins in U.S. foreign policy, which are something that we're not used to seeing. When another administration came into power and the old administration hadn't fully agreed with the idea that there would be a transition and continued to remain a candidate on the stage for the next time, the whole world was not sure what was durable, whether this attempt to regain the status quo ante would change. And I'll say I have also been the director of the State Department's Office for Multilateral Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. And one thing that we saw there was that because even our closest allies and partners were not certain that they could trust U.S. policy to remain what it was, they decided that it was in a way easier to work together without us than to loop us in early. And so if I said before that United States leadership is critical to getting things done in the international system, one of those reasons is our global reach, as I noted, but another one of them is that we can make decisions quickly. And the European Union, which also could in a way be a leader on many of the same values issues that we are, has to come to consensus at 27 states before they can make a decision. Before 2017, they would include us in that consensus at that time 28. But because the rhetoric of the Trump administration, even if this wasn't borne out in practice so much, was one that appeared to build up the countries less developed and less durable democratic institutions within the European Union at the expense of rhetorical support for our longstanding allies in Western Europe. The countries of Western Europe in particular sort of stopped trusting the United States to be part of that initial consensus. And so since your question is about NATO, I'll say the United States hosted the 75th anniversary summit of NATO this summer. And all eyes were on this summit because it had to be a success because of the war in Ukraine, because of the importance of Eastern Flank security, because the NATO summit also addressed things like partners for peace in other parts of the world. So Jordan was present, the Republic of Georgia was present, Asian partners were present, Kosovo was present. But there also was a focus on how we would respond to the challenge of cybersecurity and the challenge of Huawei and the challenge of China as an emerging strategic rival to NATO and its partnerships. And so I think the difference that you'll see, that we already have seen in the candidacies of the two candidates for president, and the difference that you will see depending on who wins is whether or not our closest allies in NATO include us in the early rounds of negotiations when they come to internal consensus, or whether they decide that they're going to have what French President Macron has called strategic autonomy, sort of their own set of decisions first, that then they present to us as something we can't change because it would be too hard now to change it with the other 27.
So as I'm listening to this discussion, it occurs to me that there's a thread that ties together this question about the marginal nature of changes in U.S. policy between administrations and the personnel question that you've raised. And that is that normally an incoming and outgoing administration in the United States, it looks a little bit like a tumble dryer, right? So you've got people on top, people on bottom, and the volume more or less is the same. So you've got a Democratic administration in power. It's defeated by a Republican administration. Those people come down, the next group comes up, and the jobs all sort of switch inside the family, right? So you've got Republicans in this scenario who are coming out of think tanks and consulting firms and universities, Democrats who are going in to fill those same jobs. And that creates a tremendous amount of predictability and conversation, especially for allies and partners, because the people who have been out of power spend a lot of their time going to Abu Dhabi and London and Paris, talking to our allied and partner governments. And so even to the extent that there are going to be marginal changes in policy, or perhaps even more than marginal changes in policy with the incoming administration, they're all fairly well known by foreign elites well in advance of the actual transition and implementation, right? So there is, I think, a greater sense of continuity than perhaps even, I mean, there is some continuity and there is an even greater sense of continuity. The first Trump administration was very different in this regard because it was both rejected by and itself rejected the sort of quote unquote normal Republican institutionalists, especially in the foreign policy space. And so you saw this as people were sort of scrambling to get jobs as they left the Obama administration. All of those think tanks and consulting, they weren't emptying out, right? Those folks were not going in the way that they normally would. And so there was a real problem in Washington. And that caused a number of things. It caused a degree of unpredictability. It also caused a degree of amateurness in the initial year of the Trump administration, because the people coming in hadn't been through sort of the apprenticeship stage of their careers and didn't necessarily know how to control the mechanisms of government. Now, over time, you had sort of a period of rapprochement between the Trump administration and the, again, quote unquote, normal Republicans. Things began to at least run a little bit more smoothly, but that broke down. And so now, as you look at a possible Trump 2 administration, there's a huge question as to what does the transition look like and who is coming in. You've got people, the sort of the old establishment Republicans, many of whom have successfully rebranded themselves as MAGA Trump Republicans. What they actually believe and how they would act in an administration is very difficult to predict. You've got people who are ideologues who have set up institutions that did not exist in 2016. And who now assert that they are the people who would be called upon by a returning Trump administration. And those ideologies span a tremendous distance from sort of, you know, a fairly traditional but hard right in the United States to kind of a Christian nationalism, which has not had a recent history in our politics, all of whom have foreign policy views. And so beginning to guess at how those would end up playing, and if you're a European government, if you're a Gulf government, trying to figure out who should we be talking to get some preview of what's going to happen, I think is virtually impossible. And you go from, so again, if the actual truth is sort of this level of continuity and it normally feels up here, it's now going to feel way down here just because those conversations are currently unknowable.
Sorry, I want to add one other thing, which is that it's also really unusual that in this election we are looking at the potential for the winner to be a different candidate from the same party, because we haven't had that happen in over 2 decades. And so we don't know what it looks like. And since the candidate who's running is a sitting vice president, she hasn't made clear necessarily at a very granular level the differences that she might actually have from her current boss, President Biden. And as someone who has worked for her, I can tell you she actually does have some policy differences. But she is a very good and loyal vice president and subordinate to her boss. And so we'll see when she comes in, who staffs her, because her foreign policy staff to date has consisted of 12 people. Besides Phil Gordon and Rebecca Lissner. So that is not very many. And we don't know because she hasn't said publicly what exactly she might change.
Can I just jump in there? Because obviously this is my hobby horse. This is what I like to do all day, to try to read the tea leaves a little bit. And so I think that Jarrett's right that the 2016 to 2017 shift when the Trump administration came in was crucial, particularly in the case of China. And in a recent book, available in all good bookstores, called The End of Engagement, I track the types of experts that Trump brought in with him, and he brought in a very different group of advisors than previous administrations had. US policy toward China had been pretty bipartisan. The idea had been to bring China into the international system, and that will socialize China and hopefully lead to some form of opening, maybe even in a democratic direction. That had survived all the way into the second Obama administration, although there were people that were starting to think that this wasn't, that this needed to shift. So there is a debate about whether, had Hillary Clinton won in 2016, you would have seen the same type of shift from engagement to a strategy called strategic competition, strategic rivalry, Robin used as well. My argument in the book is that no, you wouldn't, because Trump brought in not only different voices, but different types of voices. These were much more military security types of people, typified by the sort of the brainchild of strategic competition, Matthew Pottinger. Matthew Pottinger was the one who wrote a new way of thinking about the Indo-Pacific and US-China rivalry. What then happened was that the Democrats were put on the back foot, and it looked like the Republicans were going to own China hawkishness. And the Democrats then had to think about how to react. And people like Eli Ratner, Kurt Campbell, who subsequently went in with Biden, decided that they needed to make a play quite quickly so that the Republicans wouldn't own China hawkishness. And so Biden then took in a group of advisors that were speaking a very similar language to the Republicans on China, that China is a strategic competitor, we need to think about decoupling and de-risking. And the 4 years of the Biden administration has really been operationalizing that in a full way, including things like massive domestic investment in things like in chips, etc. So the question then is, well, what happens if Biden, if Harris gets in or if Trump gets in? If Harris gets in, we're going to see a very sort of a continuation of the Biden approach vis-a-vis China. But Trump is the wild card. If Trump gets in, then exactly like you said, we don't know. We may get a more hawkish group of advisors. Robert O'Brien, who was Trump's previous national security advisor, may take the helm. What we do know for certain is that there will be a very immediate emphasis on tariffs on things like Chinese electric vehicles. Perhaps as much as a 500% tariff has been sort of mooted. And that's tied to a different constituency, though, which is very interesting, which is not national security hawk. It is a group of more old-style Republican protectionists with Robert Lighthizer, a former trade representative at their core. Robert Lighthizer was well liked by Trump. He thinks he did a good job for him the first time around. And that's about protecting U.S. manufacturing jobs. It's quite an old-style Reagan-esque type policy in many ways. But like Jarrett said, that sits quite uneasily with the more military security kind of view of China's rise. And so when reading the tea leaves on Trump, it's kind of anyone's guess.
I know that Trump is chomping at the bit to get on with his tariffs, particularly with regards to China. But I think one of the other realities is I think it's a fairly high probability event that whoever wins this election, come January, there's still going to be a war raging in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and there's still going to be a conflict raging between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and who knows who else. And that's something that, particularly the latter of those conflicts, is something that affects us very much here in the region. I'm particularly interested in what your thoughts are, Jarrett, particularly about, so I think Harris has continued, as I've seen it, as somebody who studies domestic politics more than international relations, but I've seen in the context of this campaign, Harris echo President Biden's calls for a ceasefire as being sort of central to her policy, her public policy statements, and Trump is, I don't know. I don't know what Trump is on this one. I know that Trump likes to talk about how he, through his son-in-law Jared Kushner, had worked closely with the UAE and Bahrain in the Abraham Accords, and sees himself as sort of a peacemaker who's going to get a deal done in both Russia and Ukraine and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But it's unclear how exactly that might happen. So I'm just sort of curious as to your thoughts about how that might play out.
Well. So I guess a couple things. One is that I think you're right to be very uncertain about where Trump's instincts actually would take him here. I think that he's demonstrated that he holds real personal animus, and a fair bit of that animus is directed at Bibi Netanyahu. I think on the one hand, in the campaign period, he wants to present himself as a tougher. I mean, it's very strange, a bloodier protector, and so in terms of the Middle East, that means criticizing President Biden and Vice President Harris's push for a ceasefire, but at the same time, he's demonstrated a real willingness to sort of cut away problems, and so to the extent that you see the conflict in the United States as a problem for the conflict in the Middle East as a problem for the United States, I think he would probably be seeking a way to cut it away fairly early on. I think in a Harris administration, I think what would be very, very interesting about a Harris win would be the lame duck period, and what shifts the President Biden and his outgoing team would make in order to make things easier for an incoming President-elect Harris. I think it was very, very interesting that today President Trump sat for an interview with Al Arabiya, which is an extremely peculiar thing for a U.S. presidential candidate to do 2 weeks before the election, right? You generally, interviews with foreign news outlets are typically relegated to the absolute lowest rung of campaign surrogates. And so for the presidential candidate, the former president, to sit for a foreign interview is really unusual. What he was trying to achieve in that interview, I have no idea. Was he trying to speak to Saudi and Gulf leadership in a way that might, influence their decisions in the coming weeks, or potentially in the lame duck period? That's a possibility. Or potentially, was he trying to speak to Arab American voters? And if you look at the text of the interview, it's not clear how what he's saying would be particularly appealing, but maybe the very fact of the interview is intended in some way to do that. So I think the relative policies of both, I think you're right to have quite a few questions. The bottom line to remember in both cases is that the levers the U.S. has are reasonably limited in the sense that we can do some very, very forceful things, cut off or reduce arms sales. Short of that, it's really hard to figure out how to influence the behavior of the various regional actors. And so if you don't think that either of the candidates is going to want to do that in the, as an immediate political cost to a new administration, what they do in order to try to achieve either for Trump 2 cutting away, for Harris, implementing the ceasefire objectives of this administration, I think we have to be very modest in our assumptions about what they actually have at their fingertips.
And I would also just sort of go back to the black box, where it's not necessarily even up to the executive branch in the United States, because there's also Congress, which would have to fund or could carry out some sort of retribution against an administration for making a decision like cutting off arms sales. It's also public opinion. And so it's foreign policy decision making is actually quite constrained and can't change that much, even when a new president wants to.
I wonder if I can just ask you one quick question about. I have read reports that there's a situation in which it makes sense for Harris to come out much stronger on the Israel-Palestine question. That polling is showing that she could pull a lot more of the American Muslim vote. I just wondered if you had any inside track as to why she hasn't decided to go that route and is instead either not actually thinking about that at all or decided not to.
Jarrett may have something to add to this, but I think there's two reasons. One of which is that she doesn't want to overpromise something that she doesn't know for sure she would be able to deliver because of Congress and public opinion and some of her campaign funders. And the other one is that she is a loyal foot soldier of her boss, President Biden, and can't contradict his policy while he is still the president of the United States. She can and has tried to influence him in many ways throughout the duration of this conflict since October 7th. She's sat down with him, as she's said on TV many times, for a weekly lunch at which she has stressed the importance of delivery of humanitarian assistance. She was the first person to say ceasefire publicly in the administration, but she is still the sitting vice president.
I think that we can absolutely expect that a President Harris, a President-elect Harris, would have important differences in nuance on the current conflict in the Middle East from President Biden. Right? I mean, they come at it from such wildly different histories and perspectives. The reality is that the U.S. presidential campaign does not reward debates of nuance like that, especially as regards foreign policy. Robin started by saying that historically we've had a view that politics ends at the water's edge. One way to think about that is that there has been a sort of a broad bipartisan consensus about our foreign policy objectives. Another way to think about it is that people don't care. Our politics ends at the water's edge. And so if you start to try to engage in a nuanced debate about something that relatively small groups of voters care a great deal about, but the broad bulk of voters are not paying attention to, you are spending a tremendous amount of campaign capital probably in what is at a minimum an extremely unusual way. And so I think it is the farthest thing from surprising that the vice president has tried to indicate some difference in perspective without actually laying out a disagreement in policy.
So sort of diving in a little bit more deeply here, beyond the ongoing conflict in Gaza and in southern Lebanon, the questions over Iran's nuclear ambitions also still loom. One of the big decisions that Trump made when he entered the White House in 2017 is, I'm ripping up President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. It's a bad deal. I'm getting rid of it. And so the question now is, what do we do? I think that Trump has been particularly hawkish on Iran, and the question is, would a Harris administration be that different? Would they try to sort of resume nuclear talks, and sort of thinking beyond ceasefire and the current conflict, but in ensuring some sort of long-term regional stability?
Well, one thing I actually want to correct is that Trump didn't tear up the deal upon entering the White House. He didn't tear up the deal for 2 years, which, given the fact that he had run on tearing up the deal, that he had specifically referred to it as the stupidest deal ever made in the presidential debates, he also referred to the Bergdahl deal as the stupidest deal ever made, and I did both of them, which is a point of real personal pride. The fact that it took him 2 years is really striking, and I think it's actually an indication of the point that Robin made, that there is a stickiness to U.S. foreign policy that is hard to overcome. And when there was this sort of rapprochement between the Trump administration and the traditional Republican foreign policy establishment, one of the things the traditional establishment tried to achieve was to preserve the JCPOA, perhaps change it on the margins, but there was a real fear, I think correctly, about the potential results of just sort of tearing up a deal that had the full faith and credit of the United States. So the fact that it took him several years to do that, I think, is really interesting. Now, I'm not, again, to go back to my point before, past performance does not promise future results, and the fact that he would be coming in with a cadre of people who have more experience, greater control of the levers of power, does not suggest to me that he would necessarily have the same forced caution as he did in the early years of his first go-around. In terms of kind of the potential contrast between the two administrations on Iran, the reality is that any administration that comes in next is taking over a really terrible situation, a situation that was created partially by, I think, Trump's very unwise withdrawal from the JCPOA, which took a tightly constrained nuclear program that was at least a year away from enough fissile material to make a single nuclear explosive device, to an entirely unconstrained program that is now within weeks of having enough fissile material for a single nuclear explosive device. Now, I do want to say, be very careful on how this is understood. There's a difference between having enough fissile material for a device and being able to build one. So I'm not saying, and do not believe, that Iran is a few weeks away from being able to build a nuclear explosive device. They are a few weeks away from having enough fissile material to do so, and the problem is that that is the easiest thing to track and prevent. The other steps, the weaponization steps, are much are easier to make invisible. And so once you've lost control over that fissile material track, you have many fewer tools at your disposal to watch and potentially interdict the movement toward a weapon. So one thing that a new administration would inherit is this frankly terrible and completely unnecessary situation where Iran is so close to having fissile material for a nuclear weapon. And the second thing, of course, that the administration is going to inherit is this much more volatile regional situation, which makes it really difficult to imagine how you go back to essentially a nuclear-only deal. Robin and I worked together on Afghanistan a long, long time ago, and at the time, I was making an argument inside the State Department that we should be considering Afghanistan low-hanging fruit in our engagement with Iran. That we had a lot of shared interest. We hadn't yet found a way to deal with those shared interests, but we should try to. What I didn't know was at the same time, very secretly, Bill Burns and Jake Sullivan had initiated a track which led to the JCPOA. And so if you imagine sort of, I was suggesting we go for the low-hanging fruit, and they had decided, no, actually, let's go to the very top of the tree. Let's see if we can solve one of the thorniest, most important problems and see what results that would have. Incredibly bold decision, successful in its time. The trouble is that now that the tree has kept growing, right? And so what used to be the highest fruit, the nuclear program, no longer is. And the decision that you have to make, would we seek again to try to solve the nuclear problem in isolation? Do we look higher up on the tree and see if we can figure out something that we can do on these even more difficult and even more immediate problems of the region I just don't, I don't know that either team has a ready answer to that question. And it is, I'll say one last thing, it is further complicated by the fact that the Iranians have, I think, maybe accidentally, put themselves into a really difficult corner, which is that, normally speaking, if you think about a negotiation, if you amass more stuff on your side of the table, you have more stuff to trade, right? What the Iranians have done by accelerating their nuclear program has paradoxically reduced what they have to trade. Because the way the United States thinks about another country's nuclear program is capability. Once you've learned to do something, whether or not you're doing it today matters very little to me. I can't erase the knowledge. And so Iran, by increasing its sort of pile of nuclear chips, actually has ended up with less to trade with us, because our vision of them, our understanding of their nuclear program is such that we'll never again think that they're a year away from enough fissile material for a single nuclear device. They just know too much now. And so that trade space of what are they able to, not just willing, what are they able to give in return for the things that they want from us, has become immensely more complicated for any incoming administration. Oh, I'm sorry. I said that was my last thing, but can I just say what, there's something that is, there's a misunderstanding or there's a dishonesty about the way that some of the US sanctions enforcement is talked about. Right, so this actually came up in the Al Arabiya interview that I mentioned earlier, that former President Trump says, you know, they haven't enforced the sanctions, it's led to all this money going to Iran. Well, first of all, let's not exaggerate the importance of that money. The Iranians have always been able to fund their proxies, right? However much it cuts off their own people, that has never been the thing that's sacrificed. But the other thing to know is that sanctions enforcement, you raised the role of the dollar. The dollar is very, very important. It is a hugely powerful tool for the United States. It is not an all-powerful tool. And as with everything else, you have to make decisions about how you're going to, what risks you're willing to take, what costs you're willing to bear. And fundamentally, the trade that Iran benefits from right now, it's selling oil to China, and it's financially managed through the Gulf. And so the question about enforcing oil sanctions on Iran is really not a question about aggressively approaching Iran. It's a question about what fights do you want to pick with China in a universe where you're picking a lot of fights with China, and what fights do you want to pick with your allies in the Gulf in a universe where your allies in the Gulf are pretty disappointed with how you have responded to Iranian aggression toward them. And so it becomes very, very difficult, maybe impossible, to maintain the kind of sanctions enforcement that existed under the Obama and temporarily under the first Trump administration for an extended period of time.
I want to be able to give plenty of time for audience questions, but I just want to ask our panel here one more question, and it's related to the last one, because while the United States has been concerned for many years about Iranian attempts to acquire nuclear weapons, the reality is a country with a large arsenal, as has already been said, of nuclear weapons, Russia, is continuing in a 2-year-long war with Ukraine. And, you know, again, President Trump has said, I'll do a deal. I'll fix it. It'll be quick. It'll be easy. It'll be beautiful. And Vice President Harris, on the other hand, has continued to say the United States will stand by Ukraine and will stand by our NATO and EU allies. David, what do you see? How do you see this playing out under either of these two potential administrations?
Yeah, I mean, I think Robin's sort of said this a few times, and Jarrett sort of echoed it, which is that for the most part, the two administrations are looking to continue U.S. policy across a wide range of domains, but it does seem that Russia is the one place where you might see a real difference depending on who wins, and particularly on the Trump side. If Trump wins, he has said that he will be able to solve this and get peace within a day. His plan is to try to get the two sides talking, of which we can agree or disagree if that's a good idea, and use a mix of carrots and sticks against both to get both sides to the peace table. And he seems to be more willing to see that as including territorial concessions on the part of the Ukraine. Obviously, he's concerns about NATO, or his sort of dislike about NATO is there. So is his lingering sort of distrust of the Ukraine because of the impeachment couple of years ago. So that seems to me the one place that we really might see some change, for better or worse, depending on your view.
And how do you see it, Robin?
Well, if the question is how could we get the war in Ukraine to end in a day, I think the answer is that Vladimir Putin could end the war in 5 minutes if he decided to stop perpetrating it. And the war in Ukraine is devastating not only for the people of Ukraine, but also for the people of Russia. It's also devastating for global security because it represents a violation of the UN Charter and of the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty that is what our international system and its security is based on. So I would say, notwithstanding everything else I said about the relative immutability of foreign policy and the fact that politics stop at the water's edge, this is the one area where you would see a very different approach. I would say both candidates want the war to end as quickly as possible, and both candidates recognize that that can only be done through a political negotiated conclusion. But one of those candidates would stop providing U.S. assistance to Ukraine. And we know that because for 6 months, U.S. assistance to Ukraine, a $60 billion package that had strong bipartisan support in the Congress, could not make it to the floor for a vote where it would have been adopted because of 12 members of Congress who were listening to Donald Trump saying, don't allow it to go to the floor for a vote. So if the United States decided not to provide particularly security assistance to Ukraine, but also economic assistance, because if Ukraine were to win the war but then be a failed state, it would be reinvaded. I think the European Union would also, they simply couldn't keep up and they would give up in that case. And though negotiations would have to happen immediately and Ukraine would be in a weak position and Russia would not only keep the territory that is already annexed or purportedly annexed, but it would also probably try to take more. And it would then have extreme oligarchic and economic influence over a Ukraine that would be a failed state and sort of end up under Russian control. That is not what Kamala Harris wants to do. It's not what the Biden administration has tried to do, and it's also not what Republicans in the U.S. Congress want, as demonstrated by the fact that when the bill finally came to the floor 6 months late, it was adopted with overwhelming bipartisan support. Kamala Harris is motivated in her foreign policy by her values and her background as a prosecutor, so justice, accountability, equity are extremely important to her, and the values and principles in the UN Charter are extremely important to her, as you can tell if you follow her, like her speeches at the Munich Security Conference annually, or any of her foreign policy speeches where she talks about the crimes against humanity that Russia has perpetrated, for which they must be brought to justice, for which accountability must happen. And so I think her personal goal, and I think the goal of anyone who comes in as a member of her team, would be to put Ukraine in the strongest possible negotiating position by providing them the support that they need to not only defend the territory that they have, but to retake some and to impose costs on Russia that would cause Russia at a negotiating table to say, okay, we're going to retreat. And also, because a Kamala Harris administration would have the goodwill of our allies and partners in NATO and the European Union, I think we would be able to do what we did do this summer at the NATO summit, which is get credible security guarantees, not even just through NATO, but bilaterally from every individual ally, that they would prevent a reinvasion by Russia. And another thing that Kamala Harris has done, and I think would continue to do, is reach out to other emerging partners, which she has, and she's met with the King of Jordan. She's traveled to Africa and visited 4 states there, and she's traveled to Asia and met with leaders to help them come, in their own interest, come up with security guarantees for Ukraine as well, because Ukraine has been a source of food security for the global South for decades, and this war has hurt not only the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia, and our global security through the violation of the UN Charter, but it's also hurt global food security. It's hurt it's hurt our environment irreparably. And so I think it's the one area where there would be a huge difference between the two potential electoral outcomes.
If I could say a couple things. One is, I hope I haven't left the misimpression that I'm saying that there would not be tremendous differences between the two administrations. I think at a minimum, a Trump administration would be unpredictable, and that's pretty much the worst thing that I can say about a US administration. So I think there would be very dramatic differences. It's just hard to know exactly what they would be. Second thing I would say is that I think one of the things that I've learned is that to be incredibly distrustful of anybody who's promising utopian solutions. And so when you hear somebody say, I can end this war in a day, typically that means I have not wrestled deeply with the problems at hand, and I'm going to do something that very likely is going to make them worse rather than resolve them. And then the third thing I just point out is that Robin has said absolutely correctly that the president operates with sometimes hard to discern foreign policy constraints. And if you think about the constraints that would be act upon a future President Trump with regard to the Russia and Ukraine, it really limits actually the sticks and carrots he might be able to offer. I think largely to one, right? A lot of the penalties imposed on Russia are now inscribed in US law, and it would be very difficult for him to have those changed. The one thing that he would really be able to do would be to cut off Ukrainian flow of arms to Ukraine. And so that, I mean, of course, that would have a tremendous effect at the negotiating table. It would probably even have a predictable effect. I just said predictability is good. But it would have a badly predictable effect. So, you know, I think it's really, he would not be in a position to craft a really careful package that would move both parties. He would be in a position to do one dramatic thing, which would have one dramatic and problematic effect.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and I'd like to ask the audience to join me in thanking our panel of guests for coming to Abu Dhabi and speaking.